In the quiet town of Chicago, Emily built a life dedicated to care and compassion. But when a charming stranger enters the scene, dangerous secrets begin to emerge. What seemed like a love story turns into a deadly game. Will she uncover the truth before it's too late? The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small kitchen of the house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. Margaret, with her gray hair tied in a simple bun, stirred her spoon in the cup as she watched her granddaughter Emily through the window. The 25-year-old was in the backyard, hanging white sheets on the clothesline, her long brown hair swaying in the gentle breeze of the autumn morning. Emily had grown up in that house under her grandmother's care after her parents left to try their luck in another country when she was just 5 years old. The letters and phone calls, frequent at first, became scarce over time, until silence was the only response. But Margaret, with her quiet wisdom and hands calloused from years of sewing, turned every absence into presence, every void into possibility. "Grandma, have you seen where I put my lab coat?" Emily asked, entering the kitchen with hands still damp from hanging the laundry. "I have a shift at the hospital soon." "I ironed it last night, dear. It's hanging behind your bedroom door," replied Margaret, handing a cup of coffee to her granddaughter. "You need to eat properly before you leave." The sound of hesitant footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment. Liam, with his messy dark hair and still in his pajamas, appeared at the kitchen door. The 7-year-old boy had come into their lives just 3 months ago, but it was already impossible to imagine the house without his quiet presence and watchful eyes. "Good morning, little one," Emily greeted him with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Liam nodded slightly, his dark eyes scanning the room with the caution of someone still learning to trust. Margaret was already on her feet, preparing a bowl of oatmeal with banana just the way he liked it. "Today we're making chocolate cookies," the elderly woman announced, winking at the boy. "Do you want to be my special helper?" A small smile appeared on Liam's face, brightening his features still marked by the sadness of the past. Emily watched the scene with a heavy heart, remembering the night she found him curled up on the porch, shivering from cold and fear. The decision to take him in was instant, even though she knew the challenges that would come. The clock on the wall struck 8, reminding Emily of her commitments. "I need to go, my loves." "Liam, be a good helper for Grandma, okay? And Grandma, call me if you need anything." "Go with God, my daughter," replied Mrs. Margaret, hugging her granddaughter. "Oh, and don't forget that tonight we have the social project meeting at the community center." On the way to the hospital, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the cold morning air of Chicago fill her lungs. The streets of the Lincoln Park neighborhood, with its old houses and century-old trees, held stories of many generations. It was there, among those cobblestone sidewalks and ivy-covered walls, that her own story continued to unfold. The hospital loomed impressively before her. The building, a mix of modern architecture with historical elements, was like a reflection of Emily's own life, a bridge between the past and the future, between tradition and renewal. "Good morning, Emily," the receptionist greeted her familiarly. "There was a young man who came by earlier looking for you. He said he's a sales representative and that he met you at the social project." "Sales representative?" Emily frowned, trying to remember. "Oh, it must be Daniel. He showed up at the last meeting offering some materials for the workshops." "That's right. He left a card." The receptionist handed over a small rectangle of paper with gold lettering. He seemed like a very polite person. The shift went on as usual with bandages, medications, and words of comfort. Emily had a special gift for calming the most agitated patients and bringing smiles to those who had lost hope. Her presence was like a balm, a legacy of Mrs. Margaret's teachings about the power of small gestures. During her lunch break, sitting in the hospital cafeteria, Emily finally picked up the card left by Daniel. "Daniel Carter, sales representative," it read in elegant letters, followed by a phone number. There was something intriguing about that man who had appeared at the last social project meeting, offering help so spontaneously. "Thinking about Prince Charming," teased Sophia, her co-worker, sitting down beside her with a tray. "Not at all," Emily laughed, putting the card away. "Just organizing some contacts for the social project." The rest of the shift passed quickly, and soon Emily was on her way to the community center for the social project meeting. The sun was already setting, painting the sky of Chicago with shades of orange and pink as she arrived at the location. The community center was an old but well-maintained building, with yellow walls and a small garden at the entrance. Inside, several people were already setting up for the meeting, arranging chairs in a circle and preparing coffee. "Good evening, Emily," a male voice caught her attention. It was Daniel, wearing a well-tailored suit and carrying a document folder. "I hope you received my card." "Good evening, Daniel," she replied politely. "Yes, I did. Thank you for your interest in helping the project." Up close, Daniel was even more impressive than she remembered. Tall, with piercing green eyes and a captivating smile, he exuded a confidence that was hard to ignore. His gestures were deliberate, his voice melodic, and his interest in social work seemed genuine. "Actually," he began, sitting down beside, "I have some interesting proposals to expand the project's reach. Would you have some time to talk after the meeting?" Emily hesitated for a moment, thinking of Liam and Mrs. Margaret waiting at home. But something in the way Daniel spoke, in the possibility of growing the project and helping more people, made her consider it. The meeting proceeded as usual, with discussions about ongoing cases and planning for new initiatives. Emily noticed how Daniel actively participated, offering relevant suggestions and showing genuine interest in the stories shared. After the meeting, they walked to a nearby cafe. The night air was cooler, typical of Chicago's autumn, and Daniel kindly offered his blazer to Emily. "You know," he began after they placed their orders, "I've been very impressed with your work. It's not common to see someone so young with such dedication to social causes." "It's something I learned from my grandmother," Emily explained, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "She always taught me that small gestures can make a big difference." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Daniel smiled. "And the boy you took in? How has that experience been?" Emily was surprised by his interest in her personal life, but something about the way he asked made her feel comfortable enough to share. She talked about Liam, about how he was starting to open up, about the challenges and the small daily victories. "You're extraordinary, Emily," Daniel said, his green eyes fixed on her. "Did you know I also dream of building a family like that? Full of love and purpose." The comment caught her off guard, making her heart race slightly. There was something magnetic about Daniel, a mix of strength and vulnerability that intrigued her. Yet a voice inside her, much like her grandmother's, advised her to keep her feet on the ground. "It's getting late," she said, checking her watch. "I need to get back home." "Of course, I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time," Daniel replied, standing up to pay the bill despite Emily's protests. "Can I call you sometime? I'd really like to continue our conversation about the project." Emily nodded, exchanging phone numbers with him. On her way back home, her emotions were a jumble. Daniel seemed to be everything she had ever dreamed. Thoughtful, involved in social causes, interested in family. But years of caring for vulnerable people had taught her to be cautious. When she got home, she found Margaret dozing in the living room armchair with a storybook on her lap. Liam was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a colorful blanket his grandmother had made especially for him. The scene filled her eyes with tears of gratitude. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Emily reflected on the day. Her life was complete, with her makeshift family, her work at the hospital, and the social project. Was there room for someone else? The answer to that question would begin to take shape in the days to come, bringing with it joys, discoveries, and challenges that would test her strength and her capacity to love. The next day, Emily's phone buzzed early with a message from Daniel. "Good morning, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. How about lunch this week to discuss more about the project?" She smiled, involuntarily, but something about how quickly Daniel was getting close left her uneasy. Margaret, who was preparing breakfast, noticed the change in her granddaughter's expression. "Did something happen, my dear?" the elderly woman asked, her voice filled with experience and wisdom. "Nothing much, Grandma," Emily replied, putting her phone away. "Just someone from the social project wanting to schedule a meeting." But Mrs. Margaret knew her granddaughter too well to be satisfied with that answer. Her attentive eyes had noticed The small changes in Emily since the previous evening, the different sparkle in her gaze, the distraction during breakfast, the thoughtful sighs. What neither of them could have imagined at that moment was that this simple message marked the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. On the horizon, dark clouds were forming, foreshadowing a storm that would test the bonds of love and trust that held their family together. The days that followed brought a new routine to Mrs. Margaret's home. Daniel started attending the social project meetings regularly, always arriving early and leaving late, creating opportunities to talk with Emily. His constant presence and genuine interest in the volunteer work began to spark not only Emily's curiosity, but also that of the other volunteers. One particularly busy afternoon at the hospital, Emily received a message that made her heart race. Daniel had organized a significant donation of school supplies for the children in the project. The gesture, seemingly selfless, deeply touched Emily. It was exactly the kind of initiative she had always dreamed of achieving to help families in need. "Don't you think everything is happening too fast?" Mrs. Margaret asked, sorting fabric scraps for her sewing. Her experienced eyes watched her granddaughter with a mix of love and concern. "This young man appeared out of nowhere and is already so involved in everything." Emily sighed, sitting beside her grandmother on the old living room couch. "Grandma, he just wants to help, and he's been so thoughtful with everyone, even with Liam." Indeed, Daniel had carved out a significant place in the family's routine. His visits, once limited to social project events, began to extend to dinners at Mrs. Margaret's house. He always brought small gifts, a storybook for Liam, a new set of knitting needles for Mrs. Margaret, flowers for Emily. Liam, who usually took time to warm up to strangers, seemed fascinated by Daniel. The man had a special way of telling stories, turning his work trips into extraordinary adventures that captivated the boys' attention. "Did you really travel to Japan?" Liam asked one evening, his eyes shining with curiosity as Daniel showed photos on his phone. "Of course I did, little one," Daniel replied, affectionately ruffling the boy's hair. "And you know what I brought back from there? A special origami just for you." Emily watched the scene in the kitchen where she was helping her grandmother with the dinner dishes. There was something comforting about seeing Liam opening up like this, smiling more, asking questions. It was as if Daniel had brought a new color into their lives, filling spaces she didn't even know existed. At the hospital, Emily's colleagues noticed the change in her behavior. She seemed lighter, smiled more easily, and hummed while making her rounds. Sophia, her closest friend at work, didn't miss the chance to comment. "So does that mean Prince Charming has become a reality?" she teased during the break. "I've never seen you like this, Em." Emily blushed slightly, adjusting her lab coat. "It's not like that, Sophia, we're just friends. He's been a big help with the social project." "Friends? Is that why he shows up here every week with coffee and flowers?" Sophia raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Girl, that's more than friendship, and you know it." Sophia's words echoed in Emily's mind throughout the day. It was true that Daniel had become a constant presence in her life, always finding small ways to show his interest and care. But there was something deeper developing, something that went beyond everyday kindnesses. One afternoon, while organizing materials for a workshop for the social project, Daniel surprised Emily with an unexpected proposal. "What do you think about expanding the project to other cities?" he asked, his green eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I have contacts in New York, Los Angeles. We could create a much larger support network." The idea was tempting. Emily had always dreamed of reaching more people, bringing hope beyond the limits of Chicago. But there was also a weight in her heart, a responsibility to those who already depended on her. "I don't know, Daniel," she hesitated, organizing some papers. "We have so many people who need us here, and there's Liam, Grandma." "Exactly. Because of that," he approached, gently touching her arm. "Think about how many other children like Liam we could help, and your grandmother would be proud to see the project growing." Daniel's touch sent a shiver down her spine. There was an intensity in his gaze that left her speechless. At that moment, all of Margaret's warnings seemed distant, muffled by the sound of her own racing heart. However, that night held a small incident that would plant the first seed of doubt in Emily's heart. When she returned home, she found Liam sitting on the stairs hugging his teddy bear with a troubled expression on his face. "What's wrong, little one?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "Aunt Emily," he whispered, looking around as if checking if they were alone. "Today I saw Uncle Daniel doing something strange." "Strange how?" Emily asked, her heart slightly quickening. "He was in the backyard, taking pictures of the house when he thought no one was watching. And then he spent a long time on the phone, but his voice was different, kind of angry." Emily tried to hide her concern, hugging Liam and saying it was probably something related to Daniel's work. But that night, as she prepared to sleep, the awe. Boy's words wouldn't leave her mind. From her bedroom window, she watched the moonlit backyard. The shadows of the trees danced on the lawn, creating mysterious shapes that seemed to hold secrets yet to be revealed. In her chest, a restlessness began to grow, like a premonition that not everything was as it seemed. The following weeks brought a series of changes. Daniel introduced Emily to various businessmen interested in supporting the social project. The meetings, once held in the small community center, gained a new status, taking place in elegant offices and sophisticated restaurants. Margaret watched everything with growing apprehension. Her experienced hands, which had sewn so many stories of love and overcoming, now trembled slightly as she prepared the afternoon tea. There was something in Daniel's eyes, in his way of speaking, that deeply unsettled her. "My dear," she called Emily one night after Daniel had left, "do you remember what I always taught you about trusting the signs?" Emily nodded, sitting at her grandmother's feet, as she did when she was a child. The familiar scent of lavender that always accompanied Margaret brought back memories of old conversations, precious advice whispered with love. "The signs are everywhere," the woman continued, her wrinkled hands gently stroking her granddaughter's hair. "In the small changes, in the coincidences that seem too perfect." "Grandma, are you worried about Daniel?" Emily asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm worried about you, my love, about your heart, which has always been so big, so willing to see the best in people." That same night, while everyone slept, Liam had a nightmare. His screams pierced the silence of the house, sending Emily running to his room. The boy was trembling, clutching his pillow, silent tears streaming down his face. "It was just a bad dream, little one," she comforted him, holding him close to her chest. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "The bad man was here," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "He wanted to take everyone away." "What bad man?" Emily asked, her heart tightening. "I don't know, but he was wearing a nice suit like Uncle Daniel." Liam's words lingered in a corner of Emily's mind, like a silent warning she wasn't yet ready to understand. The days kept passing, bringing more gifts, more promises, more dreams of a life that seemed too perfect. It was on a Saturday afternoon that Daniel made the proposal. They were in the garden of the house watching Liam play with a new set of toy cars he had received. Mrs. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing one of her famous cornmeal cakes. "Emily," he began, his voice more serious than usual, "these past few months have been the happiest of my life. In you, I've found not just a partner, but a family." She felt her heart race, anticipating what was coming next. Daniel knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, raise Liam, and make our dreams come true?" The ring sparkled under the afternoon sun, promising a future of love and security. Emily looked at Liam, who had stopped playing and was watching the scene with wide eyes. Through the kitchen window, she saw her grandmother standing still, an indescribable expression on her wrinkled face. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I accept." The kiss that sealed the engagement was witnessed by the wind that swayed the lace curtains, by the sun that was beginning to set on the Chicago horizon, and by watchful eyes that held secrets yet to be revealed. On Emily's finger, the ring felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not only promises of love but also omens of inevitable changes. That night, as everyone celebrated with a special dinner, Margaret observed every gesture, every unspoken word, every smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. In her grandmother's heart, worries grew like the dark clouds forming in the sky, heralding a storm that no one could yet foresee. In Liam's room, the boy stayed awake long after everyone had gone to bed. His eyes fixed on the window, watching, the shadows dancing in the backyard. In his young chest, a fear he couldn't yet explain grew like weeds in an untended garden. And so between smiles and champagne, between dreams and reality, Emily's life began to take a turn that would test not only her love, but also her strength and her ability to trust the signs that fate insisted on showing. The wedding preparations began almost immediately after the engagement. Daniel insisted on a grand ceremony, arguing that Emily deserved to fulfill every woman's dream. However, she preferred something more intimate, a simple celebration with the people who truly mattered. "My love, you need to think bigger," Daniel argued during breakfast at Margaret's house. "I have connections. We can do something truly special. Imagine, all the businessmen from the social project present, the press covering the event." Emily looked at her fiancé with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Since the marriage proposal, small changes in his behavior had started to become more evident. What once seemed like charm and confidence now sometimes sounded like arrogance. "I don't need anything grand, Daniel," she replied, adjusting her hospital uniform. "I'd rather use the money to help more people in the social project." A flash of irritation crossed Daniel's face so quickly that Emily almost believed she had imagined it. "You're always thinking of others, aren't you? Sometimes you need to think a little about yourself." Margaret, who was preparing coffee in the kitchen, frowned upon hearing the comment. Her experienced hands tightened slightly on the dish towel she held, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Liam, who watched everything in silence. The days that followed brought subtle changes to the family dynamic. Daniel began to appear at unexpected times, always with some surprise or decision already made. One afternoon he arrived with papers for a new house he had found. "It's perfect for us," he announced, spreading photos of a mansion in the Gold Coast neighborhood across the living room table. 3 floors, a pool, a huge office for me. We can move in as soon as we get married." "But Daniel," Emily protested softly, "we can't leave Grandma alone. And this house, it means so much to us." "Your grandmother can come live with us, of course," he replied quickly, but his tone suggested the idea didn't sit well with him. "Or we can hire someone to take care of her here." The comment hit Emily like a slap. The thought of separating from Mrs. Margaret or treating her like a burden had never crossed her mind. It was at that moment she noticed Liam standing in the doorway, his wide eyes fixed on Daniel with a mix of fear and distrust. At the hospital, changes in Emily's life were also starting to show. Her efficiency at work remained impeccable, but there were moments when she seemed distant, preoccupied. Sophia, her closest friend, decided to intervene during a break. "Emily, you've been different," she commented, sitting beside her friend in the hospital garden. "It's like something is eating you up inside." "It's just the stress of wedding preparations." Emily tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "Daniel wants something big, you know." "And that's all it is," Sophia pressed, her eyes revealing genuine concern. "Because the other day I saw you two in the parking lot, and he seemed really upset." Emily felt her face flush as she remembered the argument. Daniel had shown up unannounced at the hospital, questioning why she hadn't answered his calls during her shift. His normally controlled tone had risen enough to draw curious glances. "It was just a misunderstanding," she justified, more to herself than to Sophia. "He cares about me, that's all." But the excuses were starting to sound hollow, even to her own ears. At home, Daniel began questioning her choices more frequently. The time she dedicated to volunteer work, the overtime at the hospital, even her clothes and friendships. "Why do you need to wear that old lab coat?" he asked one day, holding the uniform that Margaret had just ironed. "I can buy you new uniforms, something more elegant." "This lab coat has history," Emily defended, taking the piece from his hands. "It was the first one I wore when I started at the hospital. It has sentimental value." "Sentiment for a piece of cloth?" Daniel laughed, but his laughter held no humor. "You need to learn to let go, love. You can't live tied to the past." His words echoed through the house, reaching Margaret's ears as she sewed on the porch. The lady looked up from her work, observing the scene through the window with growing concern. Beside her, Liam played with some fabric scraps, but his movements were tense, as if he too felt the shift in the air. That night, after Daniel left, Emily found her grandmother still awake, making tea in the kitchen. The aroma of chamomile filled the room, bringing a false sense of calm. "You know, my dear," Margaret began, serving a cup for her granddaughter, "sometimes love is like this. Tea. It needs the right steeping time to reveal its true flavor. If we rush the process, we might get burned." Emily held the cup between her hands, letting the comforting warmth heat her cold fingers. Her grandmother's words, as always, carried a wisdom that went beyond the obvious. It was on a particularly tense night that something unexpected happened. Emily had just returned from an exhausting shift when she found Daniel rummaging through old boxes in the attic. "What are you doing up here?" she asked, surprised to find him going through family belongings without her permission. "Just getting to know more about your history, love," he replied without turning around, his hands moving quickly through documents and photographs. "After all, we're getting married. I need to know everything about you." Something about the way he said everything made Emily shiver. Approaching, she noticed he was holding an old folder, his hands trembling slightly as he read through some papers. "So your parents didn't leave?" he asked suddenly, his voice laden with an emotion she couldn't identify. Did they abandon you?" Emily felt the air leave her lungs. That part of her story was something she rarely shared, an old wound that Margaret had helped heal with years of love and dedication. "They went to try for a better life in another country," she replied, her voice low. "At first they sent letters, then they just disappeared," Daniel finished, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Interesting how people can just vanish, isn't it?" The comment, seemingly casual, carried a weight that made Emily instinctively recoil. For the first time, she saw something in Daniel's eyes that truly frightened her, a calculating, almost predatory gleam. "I think you should leave now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's late, and I need to rest." "Of course, love," he replied, setting the documents aside with studied calm. "But before I go, I want to show you something." Daniel pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket, handing it to Emily. Inside was an old photograph showing a young couple in front of a house she didn't recognize. "Do you know who they are?" he asked, watching her reaction closely. Emily examined the photo, her heart racing as she recognized the faces. They're my parents, but how did you—" "Let's just say I have my connections," Daniel smiled, tucking the photo back into the envelope. "And maybe, if you're a good fiancé, I can help you find them." The offer, made with apparent kindness, sounded like a veiled threat to Emily. She watched Daniel descend the attic stairs with calculated steps, leaving behind not just the photo, but also a deep sense of unease. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Daniel's words, mixed with memories of her parents and the silent warnings from her grandmother, formed a disturbing puzzle she still couldn't fully piece together. In the next room, Liam was also awake, clutching the teddy bear Margaret had made for him. The boy could sense that something was wrong, even if he didn't fully understand what it was. His nightmares about the bad man were becoming more frequent, and now he was sure they weren't just dreams. Mrs. Margaret, in her ground floor bedroom, passed the rosary beads through her fingers, praying silently. Her years of experience and sharp intuition told her that a storm was approaching, and she needed to be prepared to protect her family. The full moon illuminated the backyard through the windows, casting shadows that danced on the walls like silent omens. Somewhere in the city, Daniel was making mysterious calls, his voice taking on a tone very different from the one he used with Emily. "Yes, I found the documents," he said on the phone, his voice cold and professional. "The house is in the old woman's name, but it has potential. As soon as the wedding happens, we can move forward with the plan." The autumn wind of Chicago blew through the trees in Lincoln Park, carrying with it the last leaves of the season and the final remnants of normalcy in Emily's life. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered, foreshadowing a storm that would forever change the fate of that family. The morning arrived with the fine drizzle typical of Chicago, enveloping Lincoln Park in a melancholic mist. Emily hadn't been able to sleep, her hands still trembling as she held the cup of coffee Mrs. Margaret had offered her. The weight of the previous night's discoveries felt even more intense under the grey light streaming through the kitchen windows. "We need to proceed with caution," Mrs. Margaret whispered, checking if Liam was still asleep upstairs. "Daniel is more dangerous than we thought." Emily's phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Sophia, letting her know she had gathered more information. They agreed to meet during her break at a cafe far from the hospital to avoid prying eyes. As she got ready to leave, Emily noticed something unusual in her bag. Her personal documents, which she always carried with her, had been rearranged. Someone had been going through her belongings during the night. "Grandma," she called, feeling a chill, "did you come into my room last night?" Mrs. Margaret shook her head, her wrinkled face showing concern. "After everyone went to bed, I locked all the doors as I always do." It was Liam who brought the answer, coming down the stairs still in his pajamas. "I saw Uncle Daniel coming. Came through the kitchen door late last night. He used a key." The revelation struck the two women like a bolt of lightning. Daniel had a copy of the house keys. How long had he been coming and going without them knowing? At the hospital, Emily tried to maintain her composure while tending to her patients, but her mind was on high alert. Every shadow in the hallway, every unexpected noise made her jump. During her break, she met Sophia at the agreed-upon cafe. Her friend carried a thick folder of documents and a serious expression on her face. "What we found out about him is even worse than we imagined," Sophia began, lowering her voice. "Daniel isn't acting alone. He's part of an organization that specializes in elaborate real estate scams." Sophia slid some photos and newspaper clippings across the table. In each image, Daniel appeared with a slightly different look, sometimes with a beard, other times thinner or with dyed hair, but always alongside women who seemed to trust him completely. "They study their victims for months before making a move," Sophia continued. "They uncover their vulnerabilities, their dreams, and then create the perfect persona to win their trust." Emily felt her stomach churn as she looked at the photos. In each woman's face, she recognized a bit of herself. Women dedicated to social causes, independent with valuable properties in their names. "But there's something different about your case," Sophia added, pulling out another document. "The organization seems especially interested in your house. The entire property is in an area that will skyrocket in value in the coming years due to an urban revitalization project." Emily's phone buzzed again. It was Daniel asking if they could have dinner together that night. He had important news about the wedding. "I can't just confront him," Emily whispered, more to herself than to Sophia. "He knows all my weak points. He knows about my family." "That's why we need to be smarter than him," Sophia replied, determined. "I've already spoken to a private investigator who's willing to help us. He has experience with similar cases." Back at the hospital, Emily was surprised by an unexpected visitor. Andrew, one of the main investors Daniel had introduced to the social project, was waiting for her at the reception. "Miss Emily," he began, his serious tone contrasting with his usually arrogant demeanor. "We need to talk about your fiancé." Andrew revealed that he too had been deceived by Daniel. The supposed investment in the social project was just a front to legitimize money of dubious origin. More than that, Andrew had discovered that Daniel planned to use the wedding as a way to gain legal control over all of Emily's assets. "He has fake documents prepared," Andrew explained, handing her a flash drive. "As soon as you were married, he would use a forged power of attorney to transfer everything to offshore accounts." Margaret's head was spinning with so much information. Each new revelation felt like a dagger to her heart, completely shattering the image of the man she had fallen in love with. When she returned home after her shift, she found Liam and Mrs. Margaret in a state of agitation. During her absence, Daniel had shown up with a team of decorators to assess the house. Under the pretext of planning the post-wedding renovation, they had photographed every room and measured every wall. "He acted differently when I told him you had transferred the house to Emily's name," Mrs. Margaret reported, her hands trembling slightly. "For a moment, I saw something terrifying in his eyes. That evening, during the dinner she couldn't avoid, Daniel seemed strangely anxious. His normally controlled gestures now carried a nervous energy that Emily had never noticed before. "I have a surprise for you, my love," he announced, holding her hands across the restaurant table. "I managed to move up our wedding. We can get married next week in an intimate ceremony." Emily's heart turned to ice. She knew she needed to buy time, to keep up the charade for a few more days until all the evidence was gathered. "It's very sudden, Daniel," she tried to argue, keeping her voice calm. "What about the social project? We're still in the middle of the renovation." "The project can wait," he cut in, a strange glint in his green eyes. "What matters is making our union official. After all, we need to protect our assets, don't we?" The emphasis on the word assets didn't go unnoticed. Emily realized she was in a race against time. Daniel was speeding up his plans, likely sensing that she was starting to uncover the truth. When she returned home, she found Liam awake, waiting for her in the living room. The boy looked even more frightened than usual. "Aunt Emily," he whispered, hugging her tightly. "Uncle Daniel dropped this when he came here today." In his small hands, Liam held an old cell phone. The device was on, displaying a series of incriminating messages between Daniel and his accomplices. "We need to act now," one of the messages read. "The old woman has already transferred the property to the niece. If we don't close the deal soon, we could lose everything." Emily hugged Liam tightly, silent tears streaming down her face. In her room, Margaret prayed, her experienced hands moving the beads of the rosary as she asked for protection for her family. Sophia arrived shortly after, bringing more alarming discoveries. The private investigator had found a pattern in Daniel's scams. They always involved historic properties in up-and-coming areas, and he always targeted independent, socially engaged women. "He's meticulous," Sophia explained, showing more documents. "He creates a complete persona, studies the victim for months, gains the trust of everyone around them. But he always follows the same script: a quick marriage, asset transfers, and then he disappears." As the three women talked in the kitchen, planning their next steps, Liam watched through the window. His sharp eyes caught a suspicious movement. A dark car parked across the street, with two people inside, watching the house. "Aunt Emily," he whispered, "someone's watching us." Sophia discreetly approached the window, recognizing one of the men as one of the supposed investors Daniel had introduced to the social project. "They won't leave us alone anymore," Margaret concluded, her voice heavy with worry. "We need to act before it's too late." Emily's phone rang, startling everyone. It was Daniel, his honeyed voice contrasting with the urgency of his words. "Love, I've already scheduled a meeting with the judge for tomorrow. We can make it official in a simple ceremony, just the two of us. What do you think?" Emily exchanged glances with Sophia and her grandmother, her heart racing. They needed to buy time, but every passing minute made the situation more dangerous. "Of course, darling," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I need to take care of a few things at the hospital first. Can we do it the day after? Tomorrow?" There was silence on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to carry unspoken threats. "All right, love," Daniel finally responded, his voice taking on a tone Emily had never heard before. "But don't take too long. You know how it is. Sometimes opportunities pass and never come back." Night fell over Chicago, enveloping the house in increasingly dense shadows. In Liam's room, the boy refused to sleep, his eyes fixed on the window, watching the movements on the street. Mrs. Margaret remained in the kitchen, her hands busy with crochet but her ears attentive to every suspicious noise. The next morning brought an even more disturbing discovery. Sophia arrived early at Emily's house, carrying a folder with documents that the private investigator had obtained overnight. "You need to see this," Sophia said, her hands trembling slightly as she spread the papers on the kitchen table. "We managed to trace some of Daniel's financial transactions." The documents revealed a complex network of shell companies and bank accounts in tax havens. Daniel's name appeared under different aliases, always linked to suspicious real estate transactions. "But there's more," Sophia continued, lowering her voice even further. "We found records of a construction company planning a major development in this area. They have a special interest in this block." Mrs. Margaret, who had been listening in silence, suddenly stood up and went to her room. She returned moments later with a yellowed envelope. "3 months ago I received this purchase offer," she explained, handing the document to Emily. "The amount was absurd, way above market value. I refused it immediately, of course. A week later, Daniel showed up at the social project for the first time. Emily felt her stomach churn. Everything was starting to make sense. The sudden interest in the project, the rush to get married, the constant questions about the house's documentation. "He's not alone in this," Sophia added. "Those businessmen he introduced to the project? They're all part of the scheme. They create a facade of legitimacy while preparing the scam." Liam, who was playing in the backyard, ran into the kitchen. "Aunt Emily, there are people messing with the back gate." The three women exchanged alarmed glances. Sophia rushed to the kitchen window and saw two men trying to force the lock on the gate leading to the alley. "We need to call the police," Sophia whispered, already grabbing her phone. "No," Emily stopped her. "If we do that now, Daniel will find out we know everything. We need to be smarter." At that moment, Emily's phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice sounding even more controlled than usual. "Love, how about we have lunch together today? I have a surprise for you. I stopped by the notary earlier and managed to speed up some paperwork for the wedding." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. "Of course, darling, but I need to take care of a few things at the hospital first. Can it be later?" "Actually, I'd prefer now," he insisted, his tone losing some of its artificial sweetness. "I'm already on my way to your house. I'll be there in 15 minutes. As soon as she hung up, Emily turned to Sophia and Mrs. Margaret, panic beginning to take hold. "He's coming here, and those men are still outside." "Calm down." Mrs. Margaret held her by the shoulders, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "We have the flash drive Andrew gave you, the evidence Sophia managed to get. We need to act smart." Sophia quickly began photographing all the documents with her phone, sending the images to a secure email. Mrs. Margaret hid the originals in a secret compartment in the lining of her wardrobe, a hiding spot she used to store her life savings. "Liam," Emily called the boy who was watching everything with wide eyes, "I need you to be very brave right now. Go to your room and pretend you're sleeping. Don't come out until I call you, okay?" The boy nodded, hugging Emily tightly before heading upstairs. His small footsteps echoed through the house, carrying the weight of a fear no child should ever know. The sound of the doorbell made them all jump. Through the living room window, they saw Daniel's car parked in front of the house. He wasn't alone. In the passenger seat, a man in a dark suit held a briefcase. "I'll get it," Mrs. Margaret offered, adjusting her shawl over her shoulders. "Emily, you and Sophia go to the kitchen. And remember, he can't know that we've discovered anything." As she walked toward the door, the woman murmured a silent prayer. In her more than 70 years of life, she had faced many storms, but something told her this would be one of the most difficult. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret." Daniel's melodious voice sounded as soon as the door opened. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I brought my lawyer to settle some details about the wedding." The man accompanying Daniel introduced himself as Dr. Richard, a lawyer specializing in real estate law. His cold eyes scanned the old room, assessing every detail with barely concealed interest. "We brought some documents that need to be signed," Daniel explained, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just formalities to ensure everything is in order for the wedding." Emily watched from the kitchen door, her heart pounding harder by the second. Sophia, beside her, discreetly clutched her phone, ready for any emergency. "What kind of documents?" Mrs. Margaret asked, her calm voice masking the tension she felt. "Nothing major," Dr. Richard replied, opening his briefcase. "Just a power of attorney that will allow Daniel to handle the family's affairs after the wedding. You know how it is, to simplify bureaucratic matters." It was at that moment that Liam, disobeying Emily's orders, came down the stairs. His eyes were fixed on something outside the living room window. "Aunt Emily," he called, his voice trembling, "there are more men coming through the backyard." Daniel turned abruptly, his face momentarily losing its mask of serenity. "It must be the boy's imagination," he said quickly, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "It's not imagination." Sophia's voice was firm as she stepped into the living room. "They're your accomplices, aren't they, Daniel? Or should I say, Carlos? Miguel? What's your real name this time?" The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a mask falling away, Daniel's expression changed completely. His gentle smile gave way to a calculated coldness that Emily had never seen before. "Very clever," he said, his voice losing all its artificial sweetness. "But not clever enough. Do you really think you can stop what's about to happen?" "We can and we will," Margaret replied, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to her. "This house is no longer in my name, Daniel, and the deed has a special clause that prevents its sale without the approval of a family council." The revelation caught Daniel off guard. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he processed the information. "That doesn't matter," Dr. Richard interjected, his professional tone barely concealing the threat. "We have other ways to get what we want." "Like you've done with other women?" Sophia asked, holding up her phone. "We have all the evidence of your past scams, every case, every victim, every penny stolen." Daniel stepped toward Sophia, but Emily moved between them. In her eyes there was no more fear, only determination. "It's over, Daniel," she said firmly. "We know everything. About the construction company, the fake documents, your plan to take the house." "You don't understand, Emily," he tried, his voice slipping back into the persuasive tone she knew so well. "We could have had everything. I could have given you a queen's life." "I already have everything I need," she replied, looking at her grandmother and Liam. "And you never understood that, because you never knew what it truly means to love someone." At that moment, sirens began to wail in the distance. The men in the backyard could be seen running toward the alley. "The police are on their way," Sophia informed, a satisfied smile on her face. "And they're very interested in talking to you, Daniel, especially about those accounts in the Cayman Islands." Daniel's face turned pale. He exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Richard, who was already hurriedly stuffing documents into his briefcase. "This isn't over," Daniel threatened, backing toward the door. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," Margaret replied, her voice filled with wisdom. "You're the one who never knew who you were dealing with. Our strength isn't in papers or properties, it's in the love that binds us." The sirens were closer now. Daniel and Dr. Richard ran to the car, but it was already too late. Police vehicles blocked both ends of the street. Liam ran into Emily's arms, and she held him tightly, finally letting the tears flow freely down her face. Margaret joined the embrace, her hands trembling, but her eyes shining with relief and determination. The days following Daniel's arrest were intense. The house in Lincoln Park became the center of an investigation that revealed day by day new layers of the elaborate criminal scheme. Investigators came and went, collecting testimonies and evidence linking Daniel to several other similar cases in different cities. Sophia had become a constant presence, bringing updates on the case and offering unconditional support to Emily. One particularly busy afternoon, she arrived with surprising news. "The police found an apartment Daniel used as an office," Sophia explained, sitting at the kitchen table where Margaret was serving coffee. "There were documents about several women, all with profiles similar to yours, Emily. Independent professionals. They're involved in social work, owners of valuable properties." Emily gazed out the window as she listened to the report. Autumn was giving way to winter, and the trees in the backyard were losing their last leaves. Somehow that change in nature mirrored the transformation her own life was undergoing. "He had everything planned down to the smallest details," continued Sophia, showing some photos of the apartment. "They even found a detailed schedule outlining each step: how to approach, how long to wait before proposing, when to execute the transfer of assets." Mrs. Margaret, who had been knitting in silence, looked up from her work. "And to think he had access to the keys to our house." The mention of the keys made Liam, who was drawing in a corner of the kitchen, lift his head. The boy still had occasional nightmares, but he was gradually regaining his natural cheerfulness. "They also found records of suspicious bank transfers," Sophia went on. "It seems there was a construction company interested in buying not just this house, but the entire block. Daniel would act as the middleman, receiving a hefty commission for the deal." Emily sat down heavily in a chair, absorbing all the information. "How could I have been so blind?" she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "Don't blame yourself, my dear," Mrs. Margaret said, setting her knitting aside to hold her granddaughter's hands. "He was a professional liar. He fooled many experienced people before you." At that moment, the phone rang. It was Andrew, the investor who had helped expose Daniel. He was also cooperating with the investigation, revealing details about the network of shell companies used in the scheme. "Miss Emily," he said, his voice conveying urgency, "I need to warn you. Some of Daniel's accomplices are still at large. They might try to retaliate." The news brought a new weight of concern. The police had already assigned a patrol car to make frequent rounds on the street, but the feeling of vulnerability lingered. "Maybe we should spend a few days at my sister's house," suggested Sophia, worried about her friend's safety. But Mrs. Margaret was firm in her decision. "We're not leaving. This house has sheltered our family for 3 generations. We won't hide now." The woman's determination inspired everyone. Emily looked around the kitchen, at the walls that held so many memories, at the garden where she had grown up, at the small altar where her grandmother lit candles every night. Every corner of that house told a story of love, resilience, and perseverance. At the social project, the revelations about Daniel caused a stir. Many volunteers felt betrayed, especially those who had trusted him and his promises of investment. But surprisingly, the crisis ended up strengthening the bonds between everyone. "Sometimes we need to go through storms to appreciate our safe harbor even more," reflected Mrs. Margaret, as she watched Liam helping to water the plants in the garden. The boy had become more protective of the family. He always made sure the doors were securely locked before going to bed and stayed alert to any suspicious movement on the street. His childlike intuition, which had detected something wrong with Daniel from the start, was now taken more seriously by everyone. One afternoon, while organizing some old documents, Emily found the photo of her parents that Daniel had used to manipulate her. The image, once a source of so much pain, now seemed to have lost its power. "You know, Grandma," she said, showing the photo to Mrs. Margaret, "for a moment I thought I needed them to feel complete. But the truth is, I've always had everything I needed right here." The woman smiled, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Family isn't just about blood, my dear. It's about love, choice, and being there during the tough times." Sophia, who arrived at that moment with more news about the case, added, "And having the courage to face the storms together. And making chocolate cookies," Liam chimed in from the kitchen door, drawing smiles from everyone. "That's right, little one," Mrs. Margaret replied, already getting up to grab the ingredients. "How about we all be special helpers today?" As they prepared the cookie dough, amidst laughter and little messes, Emily felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The wounds were still there, slowly healing, but the love of that makeshift family was the best medicine she could have asked for. Spring arrived in Chicago, bringing with it a renewing energy. Mrs. Margaret's garden bloomed with vibrant colors, as if nature itself was celebrating the fresh start of that family. At the community center, the social project gained new life, now truly focused on its original mission. "It's amazing how things have turned around," commented Sophia, watching the volunteers organizing a craft fair. After Daniel was arrested, more people came forward wanting to genuinely help. Emily smiled, helping an elderly woman arrange her crochet pieces. The project had reclaimed its essence, small actions that made a big difference in the community. There were no more grand pretensions or empty promises, just honest work and sincere dedication. "Sometimes we need to go through difficult moments to appreciate what is genuine," replied Emily, her eyes scanning the room where several families had gathered. At home, the changes were also visible. Mrs. Margaret had turned her sewing hobby into workshops for women in the community, teaching not just crafting techniques, but also sharing her life wisdom. "Every stitch we make in the fabric is like a step in our journey," she often told her students. "Sometimes we need to undo to do better, and that's okay." Liam, on the other hand, was flourishing like the plants in the garden. The shy and frightened boy was giving way to a joyful and confident child. His grades at school had improved, and he was developing a special talent for drawing. "Look, Aunt Emily," he called one afternoon, showing his latest work. "I drew our family." The drawing showed 4 figures holding hands: Emily, Mrs. Margaret, Sophia, and himself, all in front of their house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. In the background, a bright rainbow colored the sky. "It's perfect, my love," Emily hugged him, feeling her eyes well up. "That's exactly how we are." The investigations into Daniel Carter continued, revealing a scheme even larger than they had imagined. Other victims were identified, and slowly, justice was taking its course. But for Emily and her family, the focus now was on healing wounds and strengthening their bonds even further. "You know what impresses me the most?" Sophia commented during an afternoon coffee. "How you turned this whole experience into something positive." Indeed, the story had spread throughout the city, inspiring others to be more attentive and to value genuine relationships. The social project had become an example of resilience and renewal. One afternoon, while helping Mrs. Margaret organize old photographs, Emily found the business card Daniel had left at the hospital on the day everything began. The elegant paper with golden letters now seemed so devoid of meaning. "It's strange. And to think how a piece of paper can carry so many illusions," she reflected, showing the card to her grandmother. "But also how it can teach us so much," Mrs. Margaret replied, placing the card in a memory box. "Every experience, even the painful ones, brings a lesson." At the hospital, Emily was once again fully dedicating herself to her patients. Her work as a nursing technician took on a new dimension, fueled by her own experience of overcoming. "You have a special gift for comforting people," her supervisor commented during an evaluation. "It's as if she deeply understands what they're going through." On a particularly meaningful morning, Emily received news that brought a special smile to her face. The court had officially granted her full custody of Liam. "Now it's official," she told the boy, who was jumping with joy. "We're officially a family forever." "I already knew that," he replied with the wisdom unique to children. "Family is when your heart recognizes someone else's heart." Margaret, who was watching the scene, couldn't hold back her tears of happiness. Her prayers had been answered in a way she never imagined. Her family had not only survived the storm, but had emerged stronger and more united. In the garden, the roses she had planted decades ago continued to bloom, silent witnesses to so many stories. Like them, the family had learned that sometimes you have to face thorns to truly appreciate the beauty of the flowers. A year had passed since the events that transformed the family's life. The house in Lincoln Park remained a symbol of resilience and love, its walls now holding new stories of overcoming and joy. On a particularly special Saturday morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. Her nimble fingers lovingly prepared an old cornmeal cake recipe, while her thoughts wandered through recent events. "Grandma, do you need help?" Liam asked, appearing in the kitchen still in his pajamas, his eyes sparkling as he caught the aroma, filling the house. "Of course, my little one," she smiled, reaching for an apron for the boy. "Today is a very special day, isn't it?" Indeed, this was no ordinary Saturday. The community center would celebrate the first anniversary of the social project's renewal, now officially registered as a non-profit organization with structured programs to support the community. Emily came downstairs shortly after, already dressed for the event. Her face radiated a serenity that only time and overcoming challenges can bring. "Good morning, my loves," she greeted, kissing Liam's forehead and hugging her grandmother. "It smells amazing." "Your mother loved it when I made this cake," Margaret commented softly, watching her granddaughter's reaction. To everyone's surprise, Emily smiled. The mention of her parents no longer brought the old pain. Time and her family's love had transformed that wound into a scar that only reminded her of how much she had grown. "You know, Grandma," she said, helping to grease the pan, "something interesting happened at the hospital yesterday. An elderly lady was telling me about how she lost contact with her daughter years ago. I was able to talk to her and share a bit of our story." "And what did you tell her?" Mrs. Margaret asked, her eyes attentive to her granddaughter. "I told her that sometimes life takes people away from us to show us the true meaning of family, that it's not blood ties that define who is truly by our side." Liam, who was listening carefully while mixing the cake batter, added, "Like when you found me on the balcony, Aunt Emily." "Exactly, my love," she replied, hugging the boy. "Some people come into our lives in unexpected ways, but it's love. That makes them family." Sophia arrived shortly after, bringing the latest updates about the social project. Mrs. Margaret's craft workshops had become a success, helping many women achieve financial independence. "You have no idea the impact you've had on the community," Sophia commented, helping to organize things to take to the community center. "Your story inspires so many people." It's funny to think, Emily reflected, how something that started so painfully could turn into so much good. At the community center, the celebration brought together dozens of people. The hall was decorated with works made in the workshops, and several families shared their stories of transformation. During the ceremony, Liam surprised everyone with a speech he had secretly prepared. "When I first came into this family," he began, his voice small but steady, "I was very scared. But Aunt Emily, Grandma Margaret, and Aunt Sophia taught me that family is whoever cares for us with love, and now I know I'll never be alone again." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Mrs. Margaret proudly hugged her honorary great-grandson, while Emily and Sophia exchanged emotional glances. Among the guests was Andrew, the former investor who had helped expose Daniel. He had become an important ally of the project, now using his business expertise ethically and transparently. "It's amazing how you've turned an attempt at destruction into something so beautiful," he remarked during the celebration. "The secret is love," Mrs. Margaret replied with her characteristic wisdom. "When we act with love, even the toughest obstacles become stepping stones." By late afternoon, back at the house in Lincoln Park, the family gathered in the garden. Mrs. Margaret's roses displayed their brightest colors, as if they too were celebrating the moment. "Aunt Emily," Liam called, holding a decorated envelope, "I made a new drawing of our family." The drawing showed the house, the garden, and many more people than before, project volunteers, neighbors, friends. It was a perfect portrait of how her family had grown and strengthened. The news arrived on a Monday morning, while Emily was preparing coffee. Sophia called, her voice overflowing with emotion. The justice system had finalized the process against Daniel and his accomplices. "It's over, Emily," Sophia announced. "They were convicted. All the properties they obtained illegally will be returned to the victims." The news quickly spread through the community. At the hospital, co-workers hugged Emily, celebrating not just the legal outcome, but especially her journey of overcoming. "You are an example for all of us," said Dr. Rachel, the supervisor who had supported her so much during the difficult times. "So you showed that it's possible to turn pain into strength." At home, Margaret received the news with her characteristic serenity. "Now we can truly turn this page," she said, while watering her plants. "It's time to focus only on the good things we've built." And there was much to celebrate. The social project had expanded, but in an organic and genuine way. Small groups were beginning to form in other neighborhoods, always maintaining the essence of transformation through love and community. Work. "Grandma," Emily called, watching the elderly woman tend to her garden. "Remember when you told me that sometimes we need to go through storms to appreciate our safe harbor?" Margaret nodded, a gentle smile on her wrinkled face. "I think I finally fully understood what that means," Emily continued. "It's not the difficult moments that define us, but how we choose to respond to them." Liam, who was playing nearby with his new set of colored pencils, a gift from Sophia, looked up from his drawing. "It's like when it rains a lot, but then the rainbow comes, right?" "Exactly, little one," Margaret replied, proud of the boy's wisdom. "And you know what else? After the rain, the plants grow stronger." The community center had become a true meeting point and place of transformation. Margaret's craft workshops now also included entrepreneurship classes, where participants learned to manage small businesses. "You've created a real support network," one of the students commented during a class. "It's not just about sewing or crafts, it's about believing that we can change our lives." Sophia, who continued to be a fundamental pillar in the family's life, had started a side project, a support group for women who had gone through similar situations of abuse and manipulation. "Every story we hear strengthens us," she explained during one of the meetings. "When we share our experiences, we turn our scars into bridges to help others." The house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, which had almost been the target of a scam, now symbolized much more than a family asset. Its doors were always open to anyone in need of help, advice, or simply a cup of coffee and a good conversation. "It's amazing how this place has its own energy," Andrew commented during a visit. "It's no wonder they tried to take it from you. But what they didn't understand is that the real value lies in the people, not the walls." On a particularly meaningful afternoon, Liam came home from school carrying a project he had done for his English class. It was an essay titled "My Family." "Read it to us, son," Emily requested, her heart warming as she heard the boy call her mum for the first time. "Family," he began to read, "isn't just about sharing the same blood. It's about who takes care of us when we're scared, who teaches us how to make chocolate cookies, who tells us stories before bed. My family might not be like others, but it's the most special in the world." Margaret hugged her great-grandson with tears in her eyes, while Emily smiled, moved. Sophia, who had arrived for dinner, also couldn't hold back her emotions. "You know what's most beautiful?" Sophia remarked, watching the scene. "How you turned a story that could have been filled with sadness into something so full of love and hope." The sun began to set, painting the sky of Chicago with shades of pink and orange. In the garden, Margaret's roses released their gentle fragrance while the wind gently swayed the lace curtains in the living room. The house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood still stood, stronger and more welcoming than ever. Its walls didn't just hold stories from the past, but also promises of a future built on foundations of love, truth, and resilience. 2 years had passed since that rainy afternoon when Daniel was arrested. The house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood remained steadfast in its foundations, a silent witness to how true love can overcome any adversity. On a special spring morning, Emily watched from the kitchen window as Liam helped Margaret plant new rose seedlings in the garden. "Like this, Grandma?" asked the boy, now 9 years old, his small hands carefully placing a seedling into the prepared soil. "Exactly like that, my love," Margaret replied, her smile as bright as the morning sun. "The roots need space to grow strong." Emily smiled at the unintentional metaphor. Like those rose saplings, her family had grown deep roots, nourished by love and strengthened by the adversities they had faced together. The social project had become a community reference center. Stories of overcoming challenges multiplied, and every new face that arrived found not just help, but a true, extended family. "You know what makes me proudest?" Sophia commented during one of the weekly meetings. "Seeing how our experience has helped create a safety net for other women. Every story shared is a chance to prevent others from going through the same thing." Her work at the hospital continued to be a source of fulfillment for Emily. Her personal experience had deepened her ability to understand and comfort patients during difficult times. "Sometimes the greatest medicine is knowing we're not alone," she often told the most anxious patients. One particularly meaningful afternoon, Margaret gathered the family in the living room. In her hands, she held an old photo album she hadn't opened in years. "It's time to share another part of our story," she announced, her voice filled with emotion. On the yellowed pages, photographs told the story of 3 generations. There were pictures of Emily's parents, happy moments before their passing, records of her early years in the house, and now new photos of Liam completed the family narrative. "Family," Margaret began, her voice soft but firm, "isn't something defined by roles or last names. It's something built day by day, with small acts of love, with constant presence, with hands that come together in difficult moments." Liam, sitting on the floor at the feet of his adoptive great-grandmother, absorbed every word. His eyes, once marked by fear and distrust, now overflowed with love and security. "What Daniel never understood," the elderly woman continued, "is that the true value of this house isn't in its walls or the land it occupies. It's in the stories we've lived here, the love we've shared, the lives we've transformed." Emily felt silent tears stream down her face. Her grandmother's words perfectly captured what she herself had learned throughout that journey. "And you know what's most beautiful?" added Sophia, who was also flipping through the album. "How every challenge we faced only brought us closer together." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. It was Andrew, bringing important news about the social project. A major company had expressed interest in supporting the expansion of the training workshops, this time in a legitimate and transparent way. "It's incredible how things transform," he commented, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Margaret. "From the chaos that Daniel tried to create, something so meaningful and true was born. As the afternoon progressed, more friends and volunteers from the project arrived. The house, as always, opened its doors to welcome those who, in one way or another, had become part of this extended family. The aroma of chocolate cookies filled the air. Liam had insisted on making Mrs. Margaret's special recipe to celebrate the moment. "Family," the boy suddenly said, his voice carrying wisdom beyond his years, "is when our hearts find their place, right?" Emily hugged her son, feeling her heart overflow with love and gratitude. She looked around the room. Her grandmother, Sophia, Andrew, the project volunteers, each face there represented a special chapter in her story. The house in Lincoln Park remained a silent witness that true love always prevails. Its walls, which had almost been objects of greed and envy, now held a much greater story. The story of how a family, united by love rather than blood, turned an attempt at destruction into a legacy of hope and renewal. Outside, the new rose seedlings began their journey of growth, their roots deepening in the fertile soil of Mrs. Margaret's garden. Like them, this family would continue to grow and flourish, spreading beauty and inspiration wherever their stories were shared. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Emily and her family has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions and overcoming, we've prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the transformative power of love. Share your own stories of overcoming in the comments. Together we are stronger.